Tip of the iceberg. This text can only be written during a vacation, a time where you can take a breath, listen inside and reflect critically what you've been carrying around for all these years. It would already be a start to give up on all the kinds of self-destructive behavior, in part adopted to be able to deliver everything that is demanded of us, in part to be able to sleep at all afterwards, because the thought about our actions' consequences would be unbearable. So let's stop pretending to be clueless when another bridge or person crashes down under pressure, posing helpless questions like, how could that ever happen? When in truth we've known for decades that we are about to crash the car into the wall. When carelessness has become an admired trait, we can't honestly be surprised about shit hitting the fan. I'm about to write something philosophical about the phenomenon of crime, starting from Ayn Rand's work, Shrugged, a book that has been shaping the world more or less behind the curtains since its release, and is startlingly contemporary in its description of the world we live in. A central thesis is that civilization is nothing that keeps itself going without people supporting it, and it requires people to develop their skills continuously to be able to do so. But when these people don't receive the appreciation they deserve for that work, they start to drop out of the world and flee to a secret spot they create for themselves, where nobody but themselves profits from their skills. In the book it is actually a physically hidden spot in the world, while nowadays for the most part it takes the shape of artificial virtual worlds. Ayn Rand is shunned by many people nowadays for creating objectivism, which is often thought of as neoliberalism, although she called neoliberalism an inferior, tainted version of objectivism. We have to admit, though, that her work preceded a few developments that also shaped our conception of what kind of structure for the world makes sense, like automation and ecology, to name just two for now. Still, her train of thought is so deeply ingrained in our modern world that I still consider tackling some of the issues associated with it to be productive. By the way, an important distinction between neoliberalism and objectivism is that neoliberalism proclaims everybody can be replaced, while objectivism insists no, and that's the point. Crime was, in a way, a blind spot for her. For example, she writes that people with relevant skills wouldn't bother to use these in a criminal way, because it would be way too tiring to try and stay smarter than everyone else in this world to avoid being exposed. On the other hand, in some way she already knew the solution, because at another point she writes that laws aren't there to be followed, but to enable the government to extort important people into doing what they are supposed to be doing. That's a point where executive power gets to play stupid. When laws enable you to criminalize basically everybody, the devil in the details is the question which crimes and which people you actually pursue. However, Ayn Rand's thought could still come true in a way by evolving artificial intelligence and social networks, creating a world in which not only no crime stays hidden, but by scaling automated executive power almost infinitely, no socially damaging behavior stays unpunished. Whether that is a world we would want to live in is another question, of course, because in essence it would mean abandoning freedom as a concept for good. Ayn Rand was not able to imagine a world in which private enterprises can be more powerful than any government. Her prime concern was people with essential skills not being appreciated enough. And this concern is still very valid today, because the social decline she described is actually happening almost all over the world today. However, the solution she proposed, lets everybody just think for themselves, so everybody is thought of, doesn't quite cut it either, because we live in a world enthralled by crime. Gangsters are role models for teenagers, and adults like bank robbers better than bookkeepers. We talk about human rights, but in truth we only want them for ourselves and a few people we really care about. The rest of the world we couldn't care less, because the empathy we are actually able to feel is limited to the about 50 people ancient tribes consisted of. So that's a limit engraved in our brain. But of course we can't admit that, because we still want to feel morally superior to the rest of the world with our Christian values and everything. But watching movies like Straight Outta Compton or Boys in the Hood, you get a glimpse into how it feels to not be privileged. Dragged into daily warfare, led against the group you happen to be born in, without ever having decided for or against that war. You grow up in a world where rich people get to design laws in a way that defines their way of making money as legal, while everybody else's way can be and is criminalized in a volatile way, just to make sure that none of them ever reaches a position where they would be able to compete eye to eye with the truly rich people. In this world you don't ever develop respect for the law, which is promoted as trying to create justice in the world. Instead you experience it every day as a means to defend injustice. You could say Ayn Rand didn't quite think things through sufficiently. She exposes civilization to not be a perpetuum mobile, but you could say the same thing about nations or any kind of culture. We live in a free world, and one way to perceive crime is as a radical way to make use of our freedom. Looking at it like this, its popularity is a lot less astonishing. But in order to enable a society's survivability, you have to link freedom with responsibility. And I think that's exactly where our weak spot is. When I started engaging with philosophy, I was fascinated by Nietzsche's texts. They fit the perspective of a young man very well, at least they did back then. Imagining yourself as a kind of Superman has something of an addictive quality to it. Apart from that, the reason I mention him now is one statement that I remember very distinctly, defining Christianity as a corroding morality. A statement that Ayn Rand probably would have approved of, because she claims we need to stop caring for people's desires and instead only caring for their ability to earn stuff. Not exactly a popular opinion nowadays, not least because her idea able people wouldn't be motivated to be criminal doesn't exactly mesh with reality too well. But when you try to structure a society by people's needs, over time you involuntarily reach the status quo where a dwindling minority works themselves to death in order to support a growing number of parasites, abusing every law they know of. And that says nothing about these people's social status. They can be ultra-rich or homeless. What they share is they don't actually contribute anything of value to society. So what exactly is corrupting about Christian morality? It preaches love thy neighbor, and it's probably safe to assume nobody ever suffered from that. Although there is a certain hypocrisy to it, in that it's always communicated suggesting that it applies to everybody in the same way, while the reality is that the way it's practiced, it absolutely doesn't apply to everybody in the same way. Above anything else, love thy neighbor is staged in a way to make yourself look good. So modern values like democracy and human rights only had to adopt that role model to work in the same hypocritical way. And again, today we watch how modern communication is able to undermine and expose that hypocrisy in a way that sometimes even the most powerful people in the world don't see coming, thinking of Snowden or WikiLeaks, for example. And no matter how much fake moral you invent in order to keep that dwindling minority convinced that it's their damn duty to keep working themselves to death, you won't be able to keep them from developing some kind of resistance and immunity. leading to another fascist escapade, returning middle age, or similar scenarios. In which case, that's it for a technologically enforced morality, and you shouldn't underestimate the thought that it is this realization that drives people to consider something like a civil war the lesser evil, because they may lose their lives, but at least get to keep their freedom. Words like populism and propaganda can't quite capture this, because at its core it's a matter of priorities in life. And of course the ruling class is afraid of other things than the rest of the world. So it might happen that automation solves the problem in a way where all work is done by robots in the future. Only we are not the entities making decisions anymore in that scenario. Rather, we are roughly in the role animals are now related to humans, completely dependent on their goodwill. One thing you always hear talking about thoughts like these is, well, that's something I won't get to experience anymore. Just don't be too sure about that, however. It's in the nature of that development that we don't get to find out until it's too late. A child planning to kill its parents will try everything it can to keep its parents from finding out. And while usually the parents are way too smart to be fooled by that child, we know there have been cases where the child succeeded. In a world where everybody's perspective is determined by their abilities, everybody has a motivation to develop their ability. In a world where it's determined by their desires, the motivation is to develop more desires. Only desires don't keep a world going. It's a little like considering the question whether humanity is free or everything is predetermined. We are not really able to answer the question in a definite way, but one thing we can observe is that people who believe in predetermination tend to do less with their lives than people who believe they are free, because the former don't think they are actually able to make a difference. Psychology calls this phenomenon self-efficacy, and while I don't think too highly of psychology in general, I consider this one an important concept, because of course every attempt to make a difference will fail when nobody thinks they are able to be successful with that. And this feeling, everybody knows, doesn't come out of nowhere, but is carefully orchestrated throughout the world we live in. Add to this that we spend more resources in research to manipulate people into maximizing their desires, just so we can sell more stuff to them, than on research how the world is working and how we can change it, and you've got yourself a recipe for disaster, something everybody has known deep down inside for decades already. But we just can't bring ourselves to facing facts, trying to find a way to stop that train leading straight to hell, or how to get off of it. When people learn collectively that abilities won't get them anywhere, while desires will always be taken care of, you grow a flock of unable, dependent people. In short, you create a world that isn't able to survive. That is the world we live in today. Inability is spreading like a disease because nobody finds meaning in learning anything anymore. More and more load is being put upon the few remaining people that are able to do anything, until they finally decide to shrug it off, like Atlas. Human rights and democracy were idealistic inventions. Back then, the majority was tired of centuries of tyranny by a small minority, so in the future everybody should be worth the same. Of course, the idea was never realized in a global way, but the idea was highly infectious and started to spread across the world very successfully. But in a world where abilities are worth nothing compared to desires, democracy is just a combustive agent, because nobody will vote for a government or law limiting their desires. So what can we do? We have seen that both in capitalism and communism, oligarchies have developed who found out how to manipulate the system to make it work for themselves, betraying the original idea. So we can expect corruption and crime to be constants of humanity, which we should consider from the start when designing any system. Now, when we claim that humans should be appreciated depending on the abilities they contribute to society, we should implement a limit to that appreciation from the start, because we can already expect that people will manage to manipulate the system into reaching absurdly high appreciation values, just like in the system we live in today. Apart from that, the social relevance of a skill could actually be determined in a democratic fashion. And that would also make sense, because if voting power also depends on ability, the system is doomed to lead itself into a corner it can't escape out of. Again, just like the system we live in today. You hold a big survey listing every imaginable relevant skill, and people value these skills. Of course, you can expect them to value their own and maybe their friends' skills higher than anything else. But the interesting part is how they value the rest of the skills in relation to each other. So there have to be different parameters. In the case of professions, you can simply compare the number of jobs in that profession to the number of people working there. Also, you have to incorporate a future perspective where you ask, is a world where this profession binds a majority of people to itself a desirable world, able to sustain itself? Because if social status depends on the usefulness of a profession, you can always expect trends where masses of people flock to highly valued professions. But as acquiring abilities is a process requiring time, all adjustment should be delayed by a certain inertia to keep panic overreactions from happening. Especially important, however, is the principle of responsibility. Let's take the example of elderly people requiring care. We all know the calculations of rising life expectancy and the impossibility to provide enough care to all of them, except maybe by automation like in Japan. A perfect example of collective pretending to be stupid. Let's start with the fact that 70% of old age's illnesses are more or less dependent on unhealthy choices people make in their lives. So a big part of the suffering is actually self-inflicted. Only people pretend like they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. Then, of course, an unmet standard of the quality of care being given unmistakably leads to reduction of life expectancy. That's what happens when vital aspects of care are stripped due to cost issues. Of course, we are not supposed to talk about things like that, because it means that capitalism actually kills people, and we are part of that murderous culture. The fact is just that these things happen completely independent of us talking about them. Add to this that in our world, people working in care receive low social esteem because their pay is low. What exactly should we be surprised about? I would say we live in a world that has given up on its will to live collectively a long time ago. If we don't believe in being able to survive, then of course we aren't. It's just that pressure will increase. At the moment, we can still decide to some extent how healthy we want to live, because a large part of the poison is consumed voluntarily. But the more poison we blow into nature, the less additionally consumed poison we are able to survive. A hidden kind of biological selection is happening already in that regard. Adolescents can still afford some self-destructive behavior, but people are dying sooner and sooner from the consequences of their own stupidity. So let's stop that shit. We need to fill that hole in our soul 50 miles wide to be able to love ourselves and others, stop avoiding contact with other people, and dig us into virtual graves. not taking civilization and culture for granted anymore, but reflecting on what they mean to us and what we will lose when we stop caring for them. One aspect is recognizing money for the empty bubble it really is. Because what value is money in a world with nothing in it? Or in a world so poisoned that no one can live in it? We should stop signing up for jobs we know full well to be part of the problem. With everything we do, we have a responsibility that does not depend on us recognizing it. It's there just in the form of the consequences of our actions. Also, we need to recognize personal fulfillment as the luxury that it is. It's something we can pursue after fulfilling our social responsibility. And it's necessary to speak about gender dynamics. We've come a long way shedding unfounded ideas about which gender can do what. But by entrusting a big part of the tasks that in more primitive societies were performed mostly by men, we have created a situation where men are expected to be able to compete with the government. And nobody should be surprised that that's a standard hardly anyone manages to meet. However, this has led to a growing number of men desperate to feel needed again and therefore secretly wishing for the decline of civilization. Sometimes they defect to ISIS or other similar groups. Sometimes they just keep wishing in secret, prepping by storing up on food and weapons. So we would be well advised to change the world in a way to stop these wishes, at least if we care about our culture. Every person makes mistakes, but applying modern principles to condemn our ancestors means sawing on the branch we sit on. There are suggestive phrases going around like, "We have only borrowed this world from our children." Essentially a good idea, but for now, adults are responsible for the world, and it would be a good start to stop regulating offspring just by functions of our brainstem and considering whether we are actually able to leave a world to our kids, which we ourselves would like to be born into.